Yo, I'm Broccoli Shavings, and you know what I like? Translations. And today, I'm going to talk about some translations. Specifically, I want to talk about some interesting translations in Fire Emblem. Now, to be clear, I'm not going to be talking about localization changes. Believe me, there is already plenty of discussion around that, including a whole freaking Forbes article. Like, what the heck? No. I'm more interested in the actual translation of certain things in the games. Now, granted, the words do change between languages, otherwise this would be a very boring video, but, they refer to the exact same thing. See, I wanted to do this video because when I visit the Fire Emblem wiki, as I often do, I like to check out the little etymology and translation tab, just to see what's up. And usually it's nothing special, but sometimes you'll find something good. So I got curious and decided to compile some translations that either have an interesting story, buck some sort of trend, or just plain fun. And now I'm dumping them on you, hopefully in a way that's entertaining. Let's start off with a pretty small category, characters. Or rather, character for this video. Yeah, unsurprisingly, character names don't often change all that much when translated to different languages. Proper nouns tend to be like that. But I did find one example that I wanted to talk about, and it just so happened to be one of my favorite characters in Fire Emblem, Shanty Pete. Now, Shanty Pete is actually a very interesting story and localization, but honestly, that is kind of out of the scope of this video, so I won't bore you with all that. And maybe some other day, but for now, all you really gotta know is Shanty Pete only appears in 4 languages: English, European Spanish, Brazilian Portuguese, which is actually the only Portuguese that Fire Emblem's even in, and Italian. Shanty Pete is also only ever used by all 4 languages in this specific hero's code, so we'll be using that as our example. Now, Shanty Pete is a unique name in Fire Emblem in that it carries a meaning, because the shanty in the name refers to a sea shanty, which adds to this image of the most stereotypical pirate you can possibly imagine. Now, usually in Fire Emblem, when a name carries a meaning, whenever it gets translated to a different language, the name gets translated to try and retain that meaning. The problem here is that Italian and Portuguese just didn't do this for some reason, and they followed the more traditional rule for character names, just kind of left it as is. And the problem here is that now the name doesn't carry the same connotation because the word shanty doesn't carry the same connotation outside of English, at least as far as I can tell. The Spanish localization team, however, recognized this and are the only language to actually translate Shanty Pete's name into a different name. They translated it to, excuse my pronunciation here, Jack Escorbuto, which translates, by the way, into Scurvy Jack, which is just a great pirate name, man. I love it. That is really the whole reason I wanted to do this. I just wanted an excuse to share Scurvy Jack with the world. But yeah, that's Shanty Pete. Alright, next let's go ahead and shift gears and look at classes. Now, classes, unlike names, vary quite a bit from language to language, but they usually keep the same sort of idea between translations. As such, while there are a lot of differences, not a lot of them are terribly interesting. That said, I did find a couple things I thought were funny, so let's go ahead with those. Okay, now first up, let me ask you a question. When you think of the coolest class in Fire Emblem, what do you think? Now, if you answered anything other than Dread Fighter, you're wrong. Objectively incorrect. The Dread Fighter is the product of intelligence systems asking a 7-year-old boy to design the coolest class ever, and it came out perfectly. And evidently, the localizers agreed. Compared to other classes, localizers seem to have taken some creative liberties when translating this class in Shadows of Valencia. To illustrate this, let's go ahead and read some of these translations, in English, of course. We have Executor, Terror, Stormheart. Ooh, I like that one. Dark Warrior. And last but not least, Shadow Hunter. Oh, crap. Seems are freaking great, man. They sound like something from DeviantArt, dude. It almost feels like these localizers were just trying to outcool each other, and it's so funny to see. But yeah, that's really all I wanted to say about this class. I just thought it'd be fun. On to something that's a bit more of a comedy of errors, we have the Corsair. Now, what's a Corsair, you ask? Well, it's a pirate. That's it, that's all there is to say. They're an almost secret enemy-only class that only ever show up in the Linus version of Four Fang Defense in FE7. This chapter is not easy to get to, by the way, so it's possible a lot of people have just never seen the Corsair, and those of us who have played this chapter may not have even known it was a unique class because, as I said, it's practically identical to the pirate. So that begs the question, why is this class a thing? Well, just about every language calls this their equivalent of corsair, which they all apparently have. In Japanese, the corsair is known quite simply as lake thief, which clears things up a bit. Not all the way, but it helps. See, in this chapter, the Corsairs do indeed spawn on a lake, and this causes a slight issue in Japanese, as I, an uneducated American, understand it. See, in FE7, the name for the pirate class can literally be translated to sea thief. So, if you put them on a lake, it's technically incorrect. So, they went ahead and made a separate class specifically to go on lakes. Now, this may sound like a stupid change, because it kind of is, but it was probably done to avoid all of the, well, actually people, which, to be fair, if I spoke Japanese, I would have totally been one of those people. So anyways, this change leaves the other languages in a bit of a tight spot. They have this separate class with a unique name, but they don't have an equivalent to mean a pirate but only on lakes. So they just pulled up a thesaurus, found another word for pirate, and just went with that one, with the only real connection to lakes being this little line in their class description. It's incredibly useless in the grand scheme of things, but I just thought it was interesting how this one grammatical change in Japanese led to every other localization having to just come up with some nonsense to fill in the blanks. You know, I originally planned to have a whole section about items and weapons here, but the issue here is that, yeah, I just couldn't find anything interesting. I mean, yeah, there are some differences, and some of them are kinda neat, but nothing with a fun story behind them. The funniest I could find were a couple of just straight up errors. In the Spanish and French translations of Path of Radiance, the short spear is mistakenly called an axe weaver, same with the short axe being called a sword weaver, although that one is interestingly only in Spanish. This was just a simple case of someone just reading the file names and not really double checking things, because apparently they're called that in the internal files. Don't ask, because I don't know. But beyond just false advertising, there's not much more interesting to them, so I won't dwell on them. Rounding out our video, we have skills. Now, skills are actually a pretty fun category because compared to the others, there seems to be a higher degree of freedom when it comes to naming these. Case in point, Legoo's friend. Now, look man, there's already a bit of discussion around this skill's English translation, so I'll just keep this part brief. Basically, this skill does two things for the user. Halves damage taken and reduces a void down to 0. Now, what does any of this have to do with Legoo's and or one's relationship with them? Well, nothing really. In fact, this skill is just called immovable in Japanese. From what I can gather, the only people that know for certain why this skill was translated this way over in the West are the people that actually translated it. So in all, this translation is generally confusing and overall disliked. Hooray! And usually that's the long and short of the discussion around this skill, but there are a couple of interesting tidbits if you look at some other languages. Granted, most of them just follow the whole Legoo's friend angle, but Spanish does something interesting. They call this skill Legoo's defense, which can mean two things in English. Either it refers to the act of defending Legoo's, or it refers to a style of defense like that of the Legoo's. With my 2 years of high school Spanish, I think it's the latter. Given how the skill is written in Spanish, Legoo's here is describing the defense, since adjectives come after the noun in Spanish. If it were like the first option we discussed, it would translate to English closer to defense of Legoo's. I think. Again, I'm not an expert here, I'm just kind of throwing things out there. That said, I like this name. It uses the Legoo's physical toughness to explain the damage reduction, as well as the Legoo's pride and no retreat attitude to explain the 0 avoidance. Now, of course, you can still kind of poke holes in this name, but I would argue that if you had to include Legoo's in the skill name, I think this is the best way to do it. However, my favorite translation of this skill is easily the Italian, because they saw every other Western language putting Legoo's in the name and just went, what, Legoo's? What? No, that doesn't make any sense. What are you doing? What? And just called this skill Anchor and just called it a day, giving us the most accurate translation of this skill in the process. What the heck? Next up, we have what I call the, hey, this skill is just a saying in English. Let's see what it is in other languages lightning round. Yeah, I'm still working on the name. Alright, let's get going. Make a killing. This one's interesting because some languages focus more on the money, while others do something clever with the whole, killing thing. Notable standouts here are German with dead certain profit, and French with blood money. Yeah, that one's pretty on the nose, ain't it? Lucky 7 is weird because all of the Western translations are quite different, with some of them not even including the number 7, which is very odd considering what this skill does. The weirdest one, though, is the Italian Fates version, which translates to Joker / Wildcard / All-Arounder, which, what? Spendthrift in Spanish is bribe. Yeah, that's what I ended up saying. I just thought it was a really funny visual. Deadeye seems to have no real equivalent in other languages, but most keep with the idea of just really good aim. The standout here is Italian Path of Radiance, which calls this skill Fatality, which is just wild for a skill that doesn't increase damage. And lastly, Quality Time has a good few variations with similar meanings, but the Asian translations stick out here for the focus on bodily contact. Apparently, the Japanese and Korean names refer to skinship, which is just the practice of bonding through physical touch. This is most likely a reference to the Private Quarters skinship minigame in Fire Emblem Fates. How the heck did we circle back to this thing? Thus marks the end of the, hey, this is just a saying in English. Let's see what, you get the deal. Next, we got Big Personality. Now, this one's only really fun because of the Chinese translation, but it requires a bit of backstory first. See, in Japanese, this skill translates to Shining Power of Reason, which makes sense because, magic and such, which kind of begs the question of why we even call it Big Personality in English. And that somehow connects back to Legu's friend. Like, how do both of these skills have the same issue? I don't know. Anyways, Chinese translations in Fire Emblem just often kind of go along with whatever the Japanese says, but this time they called this skill Shining Original Power, which makes less sense than the original. The reason behind this is actually kind of interesting because, well, let me just read off what the wiki says. Let's see. Shining Original Power, possibly from interpreting the Japanese as referring to the Force from the Star Wars franchise, which is referred to as this Power of Reason in Japanese and this Original Power in Chinese. I'm sorry? Like, this is just insane because that the Chinese localization team was just kind of looking at this skill and I'm like, man, that's a pretty weird name to call this. But then they just kind of went with it. So now, Fire Emblem Engage has a Star Wars reference in it because of a translation quirk that caused this skill to be interpreted as referring to the Force. And you know what? I think that is the perfect note to end this video on. Thank you so much for watching. It really does mean a ton. I hope you had fun, and that's all I really got left to say. I'll see y'all later. Broccoli Shavens out.